Look, this is an issue that's critically important to this country. And I think when people hear about it, they're astounded, because this is a crisis we don't hear much about. According to the National Institute of Justice, listen to these statistics. More than 80% of the Native women have experienced violence, almost half within the last year. On many reservations, Native American women face murder rates up to 10 times the national average. And the majority of this violence is either sexual or domestic in nature. And too much of it goes unreported and unprosecuted, and that is why I've taken a three-pronged approach to address this crisis. Number one, we need to raise awareness. Number two, we need to empower the tribes around this country. And number three, this body needs to implement some solutions that will help those tribes address this issue. But first, we must acknowledge that there is an epidemic that if we acknowledge, we can fix. We've made some progress on this front in the last few years. Since 2016, we've introduced resolutions declaring May 5th the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Native Women and Girls. We introduced this resolution in honor of Hannah Harris, a Northern Cheyenne tribal member who was murdered in July of 2013, and thousands of others' voices who have been silenced. We introduced this resolution to underscore the urgency of addressing domestic violence and sexual assault in Indian country. We've introduced this resolution to amplify the voices of the people who are on the vanguard fighting for change. Folks like Brianna Lamb, a Missoula-based activist who is my guest at this year's State of the Union address, or Kim Loring, who testified in front of the Indian Affairs Committee back in December about the disappearance of her sister, Ashley Loring, heavy runner from Browning, Montana. But increased awareness isn't where we end. We need to act, and we need to find and implement solutions. And that is why, after leading a Senate hearing on the MMIW crisis in December, I drafted and introduced the Studying the Missing and Murdered Indian Crisis Act. Now, this bill directs the GAO to conduct a full review of how federal agencies respond to reports of missing and murdered Native Americans and recommend solutions based on their findings. The House has already passed this bill, along with the rest of the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act, more than a month ago. But the Senate is yet to take this package up. So instead of waiting around for Senator McConnell to do his job and bring this bill up for a vote, I reached out to the GAO directly yesterday. A group of 10 Democrats and 7 Republicans wrote to the GAO asking them to conduct this study, and the GAO agreed. But we can't keep waiting around for the Senate to actually do its job and legislate. We need to act, and we need to pass the Violence Against Women Reauthorization Act so we can start finding and implementing solutions. Solutions to problems like tribal jurisdiction. Before 2013, the jurisdictional maze around these crimes made it nearly impossible for Native authorities to prosecute non-Native criminals, despite the fact that almost 90% of the Native survivors had experienced violence at the hands of non-Native offenders. But when we reauthorized the Violence Against Women Act back in 2013, we gave tribal governments the ability to arrest and prosecute non-Native offenders for sexual and domestic crimes. And since the March of 2015, 18 tribes have used this authority to arrest approximately 150 offenders. As of today, more than half of those arrests have resulted in convictions, and many are still pending trial. Fort Peck is one of the tribes on the vanguard, arresting 18 offenders over the last 3 years, offenders who had gotten away with their abuse for far, far too long. This year's VAWA's Reauthorization Act will build upon that 2013 bill and extend tribal jurisdiction even further, empowering tribes to combat this crisis head on. And that is why the Senate needs to pass this critical legislation and start taking up dozens of other bills that we've introduced to combat this crisis. Bills like Savannah's Act, which will improve information sharing between the federal, state, and tribal law enforcement agencies and establish better response protocols for cases of missing people. Or the Not Invisible Act, a bipartisan bill that we recently introduced that would create an advisory committee to improve on how federal law enforcement responds to cases of missing, murdered, and trafficked persons. Because, sure, it's nice to hold hearings and to write letters, but nothing can really happen unless we do our job. Take funding, for example. We worked hard to secure 5% set aside for Indian country in the Crime Victims Fund this year. That's $168 million that tribes can now use to prevent violence and support survivors across Indian country. But this set aside disappears next year if we don't pass the Survive Act to make this funding permanent. So I would hope that everybody in the Senate, including the majority, will finally get behind the Violence Against Women Act and help move these other bills forward also. Because together, we can find solutions to this crisis, and we can support survivors, and we can bring their assailants to justice. But we can't do it if Congress doesn't act. I yield the floor, Mr. Chairman.